what's equally as important, or probably more important, is who we become and how we live on that standard. Because at the end of the day, like, I can have all the Bitcoin I want, but if I'm living amongst rubble, my Bitcoin doesn't, like, the wealth is not the Bitcoin. The wealth is the civilization, the family, the tribe, the culture, the religion, like what we have. And Bitcoin simply measures that.
My guest this week is Aleks Svetski, and he's been on the podcast before. The last time he was here, we discussed his book, The Uncommunist Manifesto, and we had a great conversation, one that still sticks with me. But this time, he's back to discuss his newest book, The Bushido of Bitcoin. Now, Bushido was the warrior code of the samurai. It was focused on men embodying virtue, discipline, and honor, and those are exactly the sorts of things men start thinking about when they dive into Bitcoin. Now, I know it might sound crazy, but imagine if you knew you could get ahead by being honest, working hard, and delivering real value, and the economic system would reward you for that. How would that change how you see the world? Now, obviously, we're all accountable to the Word of God, and hopefully, we're all pursuing truth for its own inherent goodness and not for some reward. But doesn't it get exhausting when the incentives seem to run the other way? What if that wasn't the case? What if we could all make more money by being honest craftsmen rather than dishonest superstars like, say, P. Diddy? What if, at least when it came to our money, the incentives flowed downhill to virtue instead of to vice? Well, Bitcoin fixes this, and that thought experiment is what inspired Aleks to write his new book, which we're about to discuss. And hopefully, this podcast will convince just one more person to take a closer look at something I think is pretty cool. I mean, it had better, because the Bitcoin podcasts will keep coming until morale improves. In this conversation, Aleks and I discuss testosterone as an on-demand hormone, justice, mercy, and grace, masculine and feminine virtues in society, the cultural need for a warrior class, the transformative power of beauty, why courage is faith in action, and finally, self-control, restraint, and excellence. If you enjoy this podcast, thank you. Please like this video, share it, and subscribe to the channel. If this is your first time here, welcome. I release new episodes about the Christian counterculture, masculine virtue, and the family every week. Just a couple quick reminders. First, this podcast is about to rebrand as the Will Spencer Podcast. New guests, new topics, and a new look, but the same format you love. So keep an eye out for that. Also, my Christian Men's Retreat is coming up from October 18th to 21st right here in Phoenix, Arizona. It's one of the best times of the year for weather in the valley, and I've booked a luxury Airbnb with stunning views of the landscape. We'll have healthy food cooked on site, Bible study, firearms training workshops, and more. Visit renofmen.com/retreat for all the information, and I hope to see you there. Before we dive in, one more quick note. Aleks and I have spoken, and he's seriously exploring Christianity, but he's still on that road home. So there are a couple of swear words in this episode. If you've got kids around, maybe send them to bed with a good book. And you can tell them that I gave Aleks a very hard time for it, and I told him to slap himself on the wrist with a ruler, and I'm pretty sure he did it. And please welcome this week's guest on the podcast, the author of The Bushido of Bitcoin, Aleks Svetski. Aleks, welcome back to the podcast.
Will, thank you for having me again, man. It's been a couple years. I'm glad to be back.
Man, I really enjoyed the last conversation we had, which I guess was a couple years ago. But you said something, before we get into what you're working on now, you actually said something that kind of lives rent-free in my head during that podcast. And you said testosterone is an on-demand hormone. And I've used that line. I can't count the number of times trying to explain. Obviously, men's testosterone decline is big in the news right now, and there are all kinds of conspiracy theories. Like, and I don't mean that in a disparaging sense. I mean it like just kind of floating around, and valid and explanations as well. But when you said that, it's like, well, of course, naturally, if testosterone is an on-demand hormone, if our body produces it on demand and our civilization demands it less and less, doesn't it stand to reason that completely independent of any other outside interference, of which there's plenty, but even setting that aside with our increasingly comfortable world, we would need less and less testosterone. So thank you for that insight. I get a lot of pushback when I tell that to men, by the way, but maybe we can kick that around, because I'm sure it feeds into the book you've written.
I would love to, and it's funny. I I get a lot of pushback on that too, and an incredible amount of pushback from people that I don't expect pushback from. They're like, "Oh
Hmm.
yeah, but the seed oils and the plastics and the this and the that," and they'll like pull out all the other things, which are all valid concerns, as you said.
Hmm.
Like if you're eating like that, and if you're wearing polyester and all this sort of stuff, I'm sure that has an effect. But as I said back then when we had that conversation, and I maintain that, and I've experienced it myself more and more as I've been training and practicing jujitsu more, is like the body has a way of producing it or responding basically to its environment, and we are living in a world that is optimizing fundamentally for safety, for comfort, for ease, for all of the things that just don't need testosterone. Like, this keyboard here, like, doesn't require testosterone to punch the keys. Like,
Maybe
I
we need to invent a new keyboard, a high T
yeah,
keyboard.
exactly. Elbow the keys if you want anything to come out. But, seriously, like, it just doesn't. Like, testosterone is needed for a particular purpose, and when you need to protect, when you need to be aggressive, when you need to compete, when you need to push against something, and these are all masculine traits. It's no wonder that the man, the masculine, is the creature in which testosterone is most prevalent. It's for a
Hmm.
reason, right? So yeah, I think I remember you actually cut that clip out from when we first spoke, and that was something
Yep.
that definitely did the rounds quite a bit. And I've seen other people start to sort of mention it, here and there on the Twitterverse, etc. But yeah, I think it's such an underappreciated thing, and just something that gets pushback from people who want to basically theory sell their way into explaining everything.
Yeah.
When quite often in life, the practical thing is, dude, stand under a barbell or get punched in the face and watch your testosterone go up.
Yeah.
Like that's really as simple as it is.
Yeah, I think that there are lots of environmental factors that kind of feed into it. But even if you were to completely purify your diet and your physical environment of all toxins and live out in the jungle, right? And eat entirely naturally grown foods and everything, I still think you would probably go a long way towards reversing the decline, but without struggle. If you still
Mhm,
have a life of ease, you're just naturally not going to become the kind of man who has a body that produces testosterone to meet challenges. And so
mhm,
it seems like such a simple idea that puts the responsibility on the man beyond just like, well, you have to buy the right stuff. Like, no, you have to
mhm,
do the right things as well. And I think that there are a lot of people, even today, and I think we all have to root this idea out from within ourselves, that it's not just about buying the right stuff or consuming the right things. You have to do as well. And maybe that's the theory cell kind of thing that you were talking about.
100%. In fact, it's going to touch on uh, what I think a large part of the conversation is going to be about today, which is virtue. And the new book that I wrote, that I spent the last couple of years since we spoke, really writing, researching, developing, and all this sort of stuff, is a book about virtues. And I like to differentiate between virtues and values,
Hmm.
as values are things that you desire. So values are things that you want, or a state that you want to experience. Virtues are a behavior. In fact, I almost think of like, so etymologically, this is not correct, but I guess energetically, and like the spirit of the word virtue means something like principle and behavior, right? Those two things
Hmm.
together. So a virtue is something you do in order to achieve that which you value, right? So it's almost like the theory versus the practice, right? So
Hmm.
freedom, for example, is not a virtue. Freedom is something you value, but the virtue that delivers freedom is responsibility. So
Hmm.
there's that kind of interplay. So I think, to your point about doing, and I say this many times throughout the book, actually, is look, we can sit here and write and all this sort of stuff, but no civilization, no business, nothing was ever actually built just by reading books. You actually have to go out there and do something about it, and that sort of action element implies risk, implies conflict, implies pressure, implies aggression, implies the need for something like testosterone. But there's a strong parallel there that, as you were talking, it just hit me. It's like the do versus the want, the produce versus the consume, the act
Mm.
versus the desire. The practice versus the theory cell.
It's funny you mentioned virtues, and this is something that I've given a lot of thought to, and I'm glad that you brought it up because I find it's a conversation that a lot of people don't have, or they have it in this really reductionistic way. Like they select, particularly in the masculinity conversation that I came from, they would select for this very small number of virtues. So like physical fitness, right? Or wealth creation, right? These
Hmm.
are these are specific virtues, and they would kind of like autistically focus in on like just one of them. This is how you become a man with this one virtue. And I had to try and instruct people like, no, virtues live in constellation. You can't just have a virtue on its own, divorced from any other virtues around it, becomes toxic or can become destructive. But you have to have these virtues aligned in constellation so that you know how to properly orient towards any action. So, for example, if you say that truth is the highest virtue, and the state police, or the Gestapo comes to your house and says, like, do we're here to kill your firstborn son. Do you have a firstborn son? If truth is your highest virtue, you say, yes, I do. It's like, but we all know how ridiculous that would be, right? So there's other virtues that have to live in constellation with that to produce a happy life. But that's not easy. That's a multipolar kind of way of thinking about life, to have all these virtues produce action, thought, right, responsibility, etc.
So to pull on that thread further, I think constellation is a great word. I actually haven't thought of it that way. I've always thought of it as like a spider's web almost, where you've got like tension between the different virtues. But
Hmm.
constellation is the perfect word here, which is if you look at any of the moral or virtue codes throughout history, whether they're or at least of the great civilizations, in my opinion, so the Christian West, the Japanese, the ancient West as well, fundamentally the Greeks, the Romans, all this sort of stuff. There's quite a strong overlap, and what you find with all of them is this healthy tension. The best one that I usually explain, and this was quite important in Japanese, Bushido. And so, for those who are listening who don't know what the word Bushido means, it means way of the warrior. And what it essentially referred to was the implicit code of conduct or code of virtue or moral code that the samurai would live by in order to be considered a samurai or a man of value, right? So it wasn't like a written 10 commandments, but it was like a code of ethics that was sort of passed down through action and deed. Um, but two of the virtues in the traditional Japanese Bushido are justice and compassion. And justice is viewed as sort of like the skeleton of the body, right? So the justice is like the righteousness. It is the strict line of truth and what is just and what is not. But what was very clear in the way Bushido was kind of, I don't want to say taught, but like embodied and I guess implicitly taught in samurai culture, was you had to temper justice with compassion, because sometimes if you like, a good mental model here is if you build something purely like justice oriented, you get something that looks more and more and more like probably Nazism or extreme fascism, right? It's like
Mm.
very hierarchical, and there's no room for error, there's no room for softness, and it becomes extremely brutal. And the more brutal it becomes, the more brittle it actually becomes. So
Yeah.
compassion softens, and this is why men alone don't exist. That you have masculine and you have feminine. Like compassion is more of a feminine trait. Justice is a much more masculine trait, and there's like a softening, which is coming back to what you said about a constellation, that there is multiple virtues that need to come together in combination. Like another great one is courage tempered by restraint or self-control. Right,
Hmm.
you need both. So in that's in the Japanese context. In the Christian context, you had courage tempered with temperance. So you
Mm-hmm.
had sort of that balance between the two, and balance is probably the wrong word. I think tension between the two is more important, because you can never get balance. Balance, I think, is a big scam. Like, what you get is like a flow between the different virtues, and you find the appropriate one for the right context. Like, if the house is burning down, you don't have time for like, oh, compassion, let's all be nice to each other and walk out of the door in like an orderly fashion. No, the fucking house is
Right.
burning down. You get the chair, you throw it out the window, you send everybody out. It's time to be a Gestapo. But like, in a different context, you might need compassion, right? Like, you're in a courtroom and you have a young person who's got energy and vitality and everything, and he's done the wrong thing. You might need to, like, justice might say, okay, we should chop his hands off, right? Like, because he stole something. Compassion might say, no, there needs to be some level of care given here, and an attempt to turn this person around or to correct them. So you need all of these things, and that's where, I mean, you and I are definitely not figuring this out on this call. It's like the
Yes, we
cultures
will. We
and
can do it.
yes, we have been discussing this for millennia, and the the hard thing about hard things is that these things are hard, and
Mm-hmm.
we just must contend with them as the the humans that we are. So I'll shut up there for a moment, but I love that point.
No, that's great. Can I offer you a Christian perspective on some of these issues?
Please.
So in Christianity, there's justice and mercy. Mercy is a word we don't hear very often. I think it gets reframed in English today as compassion or empathy. But justice is getting what you deserve. Mercy is not getting what you deserve. And then you add on to that the concept of grace, which is getting what you don't deserve. And so in a Christian context, the justice and mercy, they live in tension, right? The young man you mentioned, he may be deserving of justice. And in a sin and salvation context, we're all deserving of justice, which is a whole other conversation. But in an earthly context, this young man may be deserving of justice, but the judge may choose to give him mercy. And that mercy, and I think compassion, empathy as feelings, and I think this is part of the pollution of our language. Once you start making it about a feeling, as opposed to I'm giving you the gift of mercy, someone receives that gift and they're like, I've just been given the gift of mercy. I'm going to go sit and think about that. And I think this is a masculine approach to mercy is masculine versus compassion and empathy are more feminine,
Exactly.
feeling based,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And
So good.
that's why I lean on justice and mercy. When our culture doesn't actually need any more compassion or empathy, what it is asking for is mercy. But mercy is a gift, and we want to feel that we're entitled to something, not that we're being given as a gift.
Such a good distinction. Thank you. That was yeah, fantastic. And particularly that distinction where you just made there about just the masculine versus feminine energy of what's effectively the genesis of the emotion is similar, but there's a different shadow to it. And
Yes.
mercy is, yes, very, very masculine and very absent in the modern world, as you said. Like,
I
we
think
just
about. Oh, sorry. Go
go
ahead.
ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I think about the end of the movie Braveheart. Where he's being tortured, and what are people crying out? They're saying mercy,
Mercy.
mercy, right? They're not saying compassion,
Yeah.
empathy, right? It's that he could ask for mercy, but he doesn't. He refuses to make a supplication to his inquisitor, asking for a gift. He's like, no, I don't want anything from you.
From
Right?
you,
And
exactly.
so,
Yeah.
right, exactly. So I think this is just the pollution of language that we're kind of dealing with right now, that we're men trying to reestablish a masculine way of living in a world that's completely captured by the feminine.
No, this is really good. So that reminds me of another thread. Is something I tried to do in this book, which we did somewhat in the original, the Uncommunist Manifesto that Mark Moss and I wrote. I think, which you and I probably did a first. Maybe that was one of the topics of our first podcast, or we touched on that in some way.
Did you
But
say Mark Musser?
No, Mark Moss.
Mark Moss. Okay, I was going to say, because I just interviewed Mark Musser last week, and so I'm like,
Okay,
I don't know that you guys know each other. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
No, yeah, another one. So he and I in the beginning of the book had like the definitions of particular words. So we, defined things like capital and capitalism and equality and all this sort of stuff, and made like important distinctions at the beginning of the book, so that the rest of the book, the points that we made, were not misunderstood.
Mhm.
What I did in this one was even more in depth. So the book, if I may, is like I break it down into 5 parts, and each part of the book is essentially a standalone book. There's the prelude, where I go into things like equality and resisting mediocrity and vitality, heroism, the evolution, moral dimension of the universe, all this sort of stuff. Then I go into like a history sort of deep dive called Origins, where I look at the origins of the samurai. I look at the origins of Bushido, the origins of words like virtue and all this sort of stuff. And then I actually look at the parallels in Christendom, not to a huge extent, but definitely like I dig into chivalry, I dig into um, uh, feudalism, I dig into the 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 virtues of chivalry and how they
Mhm.
overlap and all this sort of stuff. But then the third part of the book, which is basically, I would say, the spine or the main meat of the book, is the 10 virtues, which I pulled out. And the virtues that I picked are not virtues that I chose. These are
Mhm.
virtues that have been chosen again and again in all successful cultures that have yielded the most successful civilizations. That's kind of like my marker. And you find this set of virtues in Christianity, and the closest overlap, honestly, I found was Romans, Greeks, and Japanese. Like that seemed to be
Mhm.
the closest overlap to Christianity, and Christianity seemed to like blend across both.
Mhm.
But the beginning first 2 pages of each virtue, I go into the etymology of the words. So the etymology of the word courage, the etymology of the word compassion, the etymology of the word honor, of honesty, integrity, responsibility, excellence, respect, duty, loyalty, restraint. And I did something interesting. I go into the English, the Latin, the Greek etymology, all the way to the Proto-Indo-European root of the word,
Mm.
and I did the same with the Japanese and Chinese pictogram. And you would not believe, like, the very structure of these words from different languages, from different places, from different cultures, end up referring to the same thing etymologically and through to the current, I guess, understanding and conception of the words. Like
Hmm.
excellence was an interesting one. So excellence derives from 2 Proto-Indo-European words like egg, e.g., and celer. And what it essentially means is climbing a mountain or separating oneself from the field. So it's about like excellence as a concept is something to do with heights and climbing and separation.
Hmm.
And it's basically the same meaning in Japanese. And I think, to your point earlier, what you were talking about, like the pollution of words, is that words didn't just arise out of nowhere, right? Like didn't just like I'm just gonna call this a cup. Like the reason we call it a cup is something to do with a thing that bears something, and that's something to do with some sound that we imbued on something that carries something. And without sort of getting too bogged down in this part of the discussion, but like words and the sounds that they're made up of and the fragments that they're made up of actually have a meaning, and they mean something. They carry a
Mhm.
charge, they carry weight. And in many ways we've forgotten that in the modern world, because these days everything is relativistic, nothing has meaning, blah 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 blah, all this sort of crap that we know and discuss. But I think that approach, and this is what I, in my opinion, without blowing smoke up my own butt, but part of the power of that central section of the book in the virtues, before I go into all the examples of these virtues, etc., and I use like Christ, Alexander the Great, Napoleon, Caesar, all these sort of like great men throughout history as like exemplars of these virtues, um, is understanding that etymology, is like understanding the actual meaning of the word and not losing that. So yeah, just
Yeah.
wanted to on that.
I'm so glad you did that, because I often, when I'm writing a piece for Instagram or Substack or something like that, or sometimes even when I write the intros to this podcast, I'll go to Edym Online and I'll look up
Mhm.
the etymology of words to understand what does it actually mean. How do I know I'm using the correct word? And I'm glad that you did that with those virtues because again, virtue is not something that we talk a lot about in our society today. Like we have virtues kind of imposed upon us by culture, tolerance, respect, you know, I guess you might say diversity would be another one. You know, all of these inclusive virtues, virtues that bring more people into the fold. They're essentially feminine, and that's not to say that feminine virtues are negative. They're not. Feminine virtues are beautiful, but when you have them running an entire society, the society begins to crumble because feminine virtues don't build society. They sustain society by sustaining the home, but you can't actually sustain society based on feminine virtues. So masculine virtues build, but masculine virtues are more exclusive, like you said about excellence. Like it's about climbing to a mountain height. Well, that's
Mhm.
not very inclusive. Mountain tops are so exclusive. Like how what if someone is differently abled and they can't get up to the mountain? It's like, well, sorry, tough, right? But these virtues inspire men to heights that other men can't achieve, but we're not allowed to know what those virtues are. And I think we're starving for them as men to hear these words that speak to the best parts of us, as opposed to trying to bash us into boxes where we're less effective women or bad copies
Well,
of women.
this it's funny. My When I was writing the book, I was using the word like moral code quite a lot, and oh man, morality just gets like so abused as a concept, like particularly in the modern world. Like everyone's trying to like when they find someone who is somewhat moral, then people use it as a way to browbeat you. You know what I mean? It's like I'm more moral than thou, and all this sort of stuff, and then your morality, my morality, and all this sort of stuff. Like it just gets really messy. So I was trying to avoid that. And I kind of make a point in the book. I said, look, if you want to understand morality, I said, go read the Bible. Don't come to me for morality. Like I'm going to talk in this
Fair.
about more about virtue, which are more like uh, which is, I don't want to say different to morality, but it's like it's related, and it's more something that you can see. Like if you have a virtue around bodily excellence and you're fat, I can tell very quickly that you don't have any virtue there, right? So like virtues are far more like visible, whereas morals can be more easily hidden. Now, this is it's not always the case, but I think you get a lot of that obfuscation. So I chose primarily to focus this book on virtues in particular, but something somebody said to me when they were reading, they're like, "What about virtue signaling? Isn't that like a big problem today?" I was like, "Fuck, that didn't even like register for me because I've forgotten all about it. Like it wasn't even in my periphery. Like I missed it." And I was like, "You know what? You're right." So I had to like write a section in the book about like how even the concept of virtue today has been like deformed into this thing like about virtue signaling. So it's no longer even about what you said, like we've got these feminine virtues and everything, but many of the virtues aren't even examined, and the essence of the virtue is not even discussed. Like you ask the average leftist or average psycho that wants to like impose their DEI and all this sort of stuff, diversity, equity, inclusion, all this sort of stuff, you ask them what the meaning of those words actually mean, they would have absolutely zero idea. Zero, 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 zero. But they're signaling to the world that, hey, I'm diverse, I'm inclusive, I'm all this sort of shit. And like it's maddening in itself. But to add to that, as you said about which virtues actually build society, it is fundamentally the masculine ones, because structure itself, like if you look at what a civilization is a structure.
Hmm.
And a structure is something that creates an inside and an outside. A structure is fundamentally exclusive. Like I have the door on my room closed right now so that I can do a podcast. Like we have locks on doors, for God's sake, like so that we can keep people out. Like we build walls on a house so that we have a territory delineated and demarcated. And the structural element, whether of a home, of a civilization, of a community, of a family, or whatever, is established by a man. And there are specific virtues that are necessary in order to do that. And there are specific virtues that don't lend themselves, as you said, to building structure, but to creating, I guess, sustenance or life within a structure.
Hmm.
And this ties back into our earlier discussion about like a constellation and having the right sort of virtue at the right time and everything. So it's all, I don't know, it's all simultaneously uh, simple in some sense, but hard to do, right?
Hmm.
Um, and simple in the sense that if we simply just focused in on the virtues that are more masculine, more structurally oriented as a guide for civilization, and then within communities or within the household, wherever relevant, um, focused in on those virtues there, like we would immediately fix like I think 80% of the problems that we
Hmm.
have today. But there's like this inversion and this like incessant attempt to make dudes basically feel guilty about everything that we do, everything that we think, everything that we try and accomplish, um, because it's not feminine enough, it's not inclusive enough, etc. So anyway, I think your audience knows that, so I don't have to harp on about that point.
No, I think it's actually really, I think it's really important because when we did this thing called sexual liberation, right, which sort of
Mhm,
fueled
mhm,
feminism, what we did is not me, not you, but generations before us determined that women deserved a place in the market, right, like the economy and the government, and so we
mhm,
liberated women from the home. Now, men and women are different. I think we can all agree on that at this point. So, men and women have different innate value systems, and so when you bring women out of the home into the marketplace with men, and women bring their innate value systems with them, there's going to
mhm,
be a clash. There's going to be a
mhm,
clash of women's values versus men's values, right? And so somewhere along the line, we just kind of accepted that, well, women can't compete on men's playing field. They just can't. Right? I understand that there are females that can beat average. There are excellent females that can beat average males,
average
but
men,
the
yeah.
yeah, but the best woman at anything is not even close to the best man at a thing, right? When in terms of competition, intelligence, like this is real, right? These things are real. So what we had to do was in order to make the playing field level, we had to impose feminine values on men,
Mhm,
and that
mhm,
was all taking place before we got here, right? That we were I was born into that world. I lived in that world in San Francisco. I can't even imagine. I left that world almost 10 years ago, so I can't even imagine what it's like right now. But this is the world that we're all kind of living. In fact, we're watching it play out on the stage of the presidential election, where you have feminine values versus masculine values. That is what this election is about. It's not
mhm,
about It's not about policy. It's not about different ideas. It's not even about the border per se. It's about
mhm,
feminine values versus masculine values. Period. That is what it is,
mhm,
right? And
mhm.
and which has a hold over the particular voter's psyche. So when we demolished masculine values to make way for feminine values, what have we seen? Not that feminine values are bad. They're incredibly productive inside the home, for making a home, for making a house into a home, for sustaining and nurturing the next generations. But when you bring it out into the marketplace, it becomes corrosive. For the
Mhm.
same reason, when you bring masculine values too much into the home in terms like we're going to build, you can overdrive your family and you don't want to do that. So when we collapse the separate spheres into one big mass of society, we lost the ability to make distinguishing features and say, well, this is good for this and this is good for that. And so that has had a particular impact on men because you said like it's an uphill struggle to get back to a point where we as men can talk about these ideas and then embody them and then gain proficiency in them in a world that's essentially been captured by feminine ideals run amok. Again, I don't want to say that feminine ideals are bad. They're not. They're not innately bad. They're how women were made. But when they subsume the masculine ideals, it becomes bad. It becomes bad for everybody.
It reminds me of like taking a flower out of a garden and then like placing it in like a harsh environment, right? Like a flower thrives in a very different environment than a cactus does, and a
Yeah.
cactus is like far more masculine, for example, than a flower, and like the cactus is prickly, and it has evolved in a particular way, um, because exists in a harsher environment, and the two just don't play nice together. And this is obviously one of the big, just like classic hypocrisies of the whole diversity thing, is like in an attempt to make everything multicultural and everything diverse in a particular single territory, and what they end up doing is they kill all diversity, and they kill
That's
the
right.
the differences that actually create genuine, like, organic diversity. There's like a big difference between the enforced one and the natural one, and you get the natural one purely by acknowledging these differences that you just alluded to. There was something else I wanted to mention there about, like, um, men, women. Anyway, I've forgotten it. It'll come back. It'll come back.
Yeah, that's fine. So I guess so. I want to make sure that we gave the title of your book, which is called "The Bushido of Bitcoin." I think we just kind of just drove off off road so excitedly, like, oh, by the way, the exit there was Bushido of Bitcoin. So what was it? You said you've been working on it for a couple of years since your book with Mark Moss, and that was when we talked last, when you wrote the
Yeah.
Uncommunist Manifesto. So what was it that inspired the Bushido of Bitcoin? And I guess you told me earlier that it's over 300 pages now. So this must be something that's pretty near and dear to you.
Yeah. So the original inspiration actually came from, I had a really great conversation with Eric Kaysen. I don't know if you've come across him at
Mm-mm.
all in the Bitcoin space, but he's an interesting character, and we spoke in 2022, kind of around the time when you and I first met. I think, actually, I
Mm-hmm.
remember I was in Austin at the time, and we discussed, like, Bitcoin and how there seemed to be this, like, emergent value system among Bitcoiners, and like that was forming. And we also spoke simultaneously about a book called Shogun by James
Mm-hmm.
Clavell, which is
Mm-hmm.
now a TV series, but book is fantastic. TV series, actually, they finally did a half decent job of something that didn't totally turn into a woke fest. But that's that.
I've heard. I think I've heard good things about it.
Yeah, they finally. Apparently, like, the main actor there, Hiroyuki Sanada, he's like based as hell.
Mm.
He was like, I will not be a part of this movie if that's what's going to happen. So they
Amazing.
thankfully stuck to at least the spirit of the book, which is great. So anyway, that discussion, that podcast that we did, was called Bushido of Bitcoin. But at the time, the original genesis of the idea was like, okay, could I write a book that looks at the Japanese Bushido and the virtues there, and the virtues that are emerging out of the Bitcoin space, and find what the overlap is. So it's kind of like going to be a simple book, 20,000 words, whatever. But as I started writing this, and there was a period where I had a bit of a hiatus from writing in 2023, but I evolved as a person. Like, I went and I did my 10,000 hours of, like, history, and I went down multiple rabbit holes. Definitely went down the Japanese rabbit hole, went way down the ancient Greco-Macedonian Hellenistic rabbit hole, Roman rabbit hole, medieval Christian West rabbit hole. What else did I go down? There was a couple other things in there, Chesterton, stuff like that, and
Mm-hmm.
I started finding all of these overlaps. So the nature of the book transformed into something more like, uh, the question I came to want to answer was more something like this: if we are on the precipice of a new age, something akin to when Christianity sort of became the West after Rome, right? There was a complete there was a change in civilization. If we're on the precipice of something similar to that, what are the virtues that we should seek to embody to succeed in a new world? Because the world cannot continue the way it's going at the moment. Like, you can't
Right.
build on continuous lies. You can't build on continuous gaslighting. You can't build on printed paper money. You can't build on a fake economy. Like, all of this sort of stuff is self-defeating in the end, right? The only real question is how much collateral damage occurs until men, strong men in the true definition of the word, go and take fucking hold of things again and right the ship. Like,
Mm-hmm.
that's really the only question here. So so then I asked, like, okay, what are the virtues we need on this new socioeconomic standard? And I believe Bitcoin will have a big role to play as the world moves towards this sort of new paradigm, right? Like if we look at the paradigm that we're currently in, we're in what I would call like the fiat and feminine paradigm. We will end up at some point moving into the sound money, masculine, new, like strength paradigm, right? A different set of virtues are going to be necessary in that paradigm, because in the current one, you need to lie, you need to cheat, you need to steal, you need to, get into inclusivity, DEI, politics, whatever. You need to be a parasite in some way to get ahead. Like
Yeah.
Nancy Pelosi is rich, you and I are broke in comparison to Nancy Pelosi.
Mm.
She's clearly doing something right in the current paradigm that you and I are not doing, right? But in the new paradigm that I envision, someone like that should not have the oxygen to succeed economically or socially speaking, right?
Hmm.
So beyond that, then I said, okay, I'm not going to come up with the virtues myself, because who the fuck am I? Let me look at the cultures. So let me look at, sorry, the civilizations that were the greatest all throughout history. And what's upstream of civilization? It's culture. And what's upstream of culture? It's virtue, basically. Like it's behavior. It's behavior at the individual level and at the community level and at the tribal level, at the family level. Like what is those virtues? And that's when I basically, as I was going down these rabbit holes of the Japanese, the samurai, the knights of Christendom, I found that each one of them had this code, particularly in the warrior class. This was really interesting for me, that I found along the way, is that it was generally the warrior class that was sort of the beacon within each of these great civilizations, that were kind of the carriers of the code. And I think that has something to do with, they inspired the lower classes. So they inspired the peasants, the artisans, the merchants, and all that sort of stuff, because there was just something noble about this warrior class, like these people who would go to war for what they believed, right? And the classes above them, the nobility, the royalty, the aristocracy, were dependent on the warrior class to have a civilization in the first place. You couldn't have a high up, you couldn't have an aristocratic class without a warrior class. So in many ways, the warrior class came to be the bearers of these codes. So the book, ended up just basically becoming this historical look into what were the greatest civilizations and cultures that came before us? What were the virtues that the great segment of their, or the leadership segment of their civilization embodied? And what can we glean from that? What wisdom, what practical advice can we glean from them? What can we project forward? And it was quite easy for me, because I found, as I said, those virtues overlapped very strongly amongst the best cultures of all. And that's why I ended up pulling out the things that I mentioned earlier: restraint, duty, loyalty, respect, excellence, justice, compassion, honor, duty, all this sort of stuff. So the spine of the book then became this analysis, or this basically this journey into history and anecdotes and examples and stories and narratives about the great men or the great figures throughout history who embodied each of these virtues. And then it goes into like a whole discussion about like how are we able to reintegrate these things. And I look at four sort of key pillars, like culture, governance, wealth, and just the cyclical, seasonal nature of civilization. And then after I sort of have that discussion, then I go into this thing which I call like a section about praxis. And inside praxis, I talk about training, physiopsychology, mastery, rites of passage. I speak about the idea of a manner bund, like how do we bring back uh, societies and groups of men, which I know is a big part of your work, and like how do we do that? Because that is critical to reestablishing and reintegrating these virtues. And then finally, I finish off with like a big discussion on the final section of the book is called "What the Future Holds," and I try and like future pace on like ideas like meritocratic feudalism, archaeofuturism, like an aristocracy, so like a structure of excellence,
Hmm.
and what that might look like, and how we can move civilization in that way. So anyway, this is a long answer of saying like the book started off as one thing, And over the last 2 years, it like really evolved and flourished into something far deeper and far more like it just touches many things. Like, I know it's called Bushido of Bitcoin, but I almost have nothing in there about Bitcoin or economics. Like there's some sections where I try and like relate it back to Bitcoin and stuff, but really the Bitcoin piece is more about we're moving on to a new socioeconomic paradigm, and Bitcoin will be a big part of that because you, you can't build civilization on fake money. Like that part, like we have to acknowledge, and that's that piece. But then what's equally as important, or probably more important, is who we become and how we live on that standard. Because
Hmm.
at the end of the day, like I can have all the Bitcoin I want, but if I'm living amongst rubble, my Bitcoin doesn't the wealth is not the Bitcoin. The wealth is the civilization, the family, the tribe, the culture, the religion, like what we have. And Bitcoin simply measures that. And that's one of the big things that I wanted to put forward in the book. But I'll shut up there for a second because that's a big explanation of what the book is.
No, that's fantastic. Actually, that sounds like you encountered some of the same ideas that I ran into when I started the Renaissance of Men, which was to look to virtues of masculinity in generations past to try and inform what the future could look like. So I want to dig into the pieces of that, but the question that I had in my mind as I was listening to that is, how have you been personally changed by going on that journey? Because it sounds like
Man,
a lot. Exactly.
man, I like I went back actually about a couple months ago and I read through one of the earlier drafts, and you could just see it in the quality of the language. Like the
Mm,
energy was completely different. Like writing this book reinvigorated something in me that I haven't felt for many years. Like I think in many ways, like the stupidity of the world, like the crap we went through in 2020, 2021, all this sort of stuff, like as much as you kind of build these mental walls and you're strong and all this sort of stuff, like it kind of gets in there and infects your mind, like it infects your outlook on life. And a lot of my early drafts, like 1, 2, 3, as I said, I went back to some of the early ones, even up to draft number 4, were very like longing for a past that's gone and how stupid is modernity and like just pointing out all the bad stuff. And like the book now is far more like vital. Like uh, just it you read the book, you feel inspired, and you want to go like run through walls. Basically, like I handed it out to a couple people. They're like, "Holy shit! This book makes me want to go to war and like take over the world." And I'm like, "Yes, that's the fucking feeling that I want." Like in the book, and writing it had fundamentally transformed me. I think in that way as well. Like in the intervening period, like I went from going to battle with the stupid idiots in the government in Australia and losing my business because I didn't want to like build a surveillance product and all this sort of stuff, and like being
mm,
honestly down in the dumps. Like I spent 5 years building a company to just have everything taken away from me from a bureaucrat. Like I was for a couple of years there like quite jaded about the world, about everything. Like I was sort of just done with things. I was like, well, I got my Bitcoin, whatever. Like YOLO. I mean, I
mm,
shouldn't say I was YOLO, but I was just like I didn't want to do another business. I just didn't have that fire again. But
yeah.
this book just I don't know, teaching these things, and this is the funny thing about sometimes, like when you talk about something, when you teach something, something in your head, you either become a fraud or it forces you to actually embody that in order to be consistent with what you're saying. And for me, it had that effect. So like I've started a new business, I raised capital again. Like we are firing on all cylinders. We're building like this uh, social network for like the uh, parallel world. So like anything to do with nomading, geo-arbitrage, network state, like circular economies, Bitcoin, all that sort of stuff. Like there's something there where like we need to build parallel economies and we need a communication mechanism for that. Like I'm like fully in that now. And man, I can't tell you the amount of energy I've got from that and from the feedback that I've had, the early feedback that I've had on the book. So yeah, long way of answering your question is like I've I feel better than I have in many, many, many years. And I credit a lot of that to just the journey of going down and writing this book.
Yeah, reading the chapter that you sent, it creates the feeling of I can imagine you finally had something to look forward to. Because what struck me about the section that I read was that you are thinking way, way, way down the line. Like we're all
Yeah,
in the ditch right now, right?
yeah,
We're
yeah,
trying
yeah,
to just climb out
yeah.
of the ditch, right? And then, okay, let's say we get out of the ditch. Okay, congratulations, we made it out of the ditch. We begin rebuilding, right? But once we
And
actually
more.
arrive, yeah, well, once we actually arrive to our destination, well, what then? Who are we going to be in that moment? And you were thinking at that point, like
Hmm.
who are men going to be? How is our society going to be structured when we actually arrive to the Bitcoin standard? What's that world going to look like? And I can see how that would be quite an inspiring way to think about things. Like, okay, we're going to make it, right? Just start with it. Yeah, we're going to win. Who are we going to be when we win? Is a pretty cool question to think about.
It really is, yeah. Like I ended up starting to think about the book as a playbook for uh, a, a playbook for succeeding in life on a more sound socioeconomic standard or a
Mm-hmm.
sound like succeeding in that world. And that's kind of like ties back to what I said earlier is like, today you get rewarded for diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? You get rewarded for being a tranny, like and getting into politics. Like
Facts, though. Facts, though.
yeah, I know, right? Like this is what
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean. It's like it's madness. Like it's like the incentives are completely backwards, and like and sometimes it sounds funny, and you see it on Twitter, and you're like, this can't be real, but like it's actually fucking real. Like
Yeah.
from the educational system to whatever, like it's insane, and I just that kind of anti-life, anti-sense, anti-God, anti hierarchy, anti sanity, anti everything stuff just can't last unless um, unless the whole thing is just like one big line or collapses at some point. And
Mm-hmm.
we will come out of this. And as I said, the question is just how much damage occurs along the way. Like, do we have to like literally turn everything to rubble before we step up and take control of the situation again? I hope not. I really, really, really hope not. I hope that we can grow enough balls, and I hope that I can do my little part with this book to charge young men in particular, because that's my audience for this book. And it's not, I didn't write it specifically for Bitcoiners or specifically for Christians or specifically for, the fucking samurai who are all dead, right? Like I wrote it for like the 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 young men of the world, and when I say young men, I mean anyone from like 18 to 40, right? Like where that spread of men, it's on us to fix this fucking situation. No,
Mm.
nobody else is going to do it. Like our mummies aren't going to come do it. The politicians are for damn sure not going to fucking do it. Neither are central bankers. Neither are any of these idiots, right? Like it's up to us, and there needs to be an alliance among us. And some people, I know this on like the Twitter sort of spheres is like you've got like Nietzscheans and vitalists and BAP people, and then you've got like Christians, and then there's some Christians that don't like these other Christians, and then you've got like other Bitcoiners and other retards and all this sort of stuff, and you got like we're all bickering, and I'm like, look, guys, take a moment here for a second and realize that we actually have far more in common than we have uh, in sort of in conflict.
Mm-hmm.
So let's look at, and this is why, once again, I should also mention why I chose virtues, because you and I can recognize virtue whether we're of the same belief system or not. And I use a great story about honor during the Crusades, which was during the period when Saladin was alive, and he was one of the Muslim leaders, the Islamic leaders that the Christians highly regarded, and he regarded the Christians as well. There was a level of honor and respect in the way they went to battle for fuck's sake, right? They were enemies, but they honored each other in the way they dealt with each other. Um, that like we don't have a fraction of that today. People like
Yeah.
passive aggressive and fucking talking about each other behind each other's backs and stuff like that over like little tiffs. Whereas these people were at war, and they had more respect for each other than the average person does today in the workplace. But the energy that I'm talking about here is that you can have two people with differing beliefs who can both recognize courage, or who can both recognize honor, who can both recognize respect, who can both recognize excellence, and agree that, hey, that is fundamentally evil, that is fundamentally wrong, and we can establish a alliance of men, an alliance of strength, an alliance of virtue around these things that we agree on. And there might come a time when we want to beat each other up again, sure, but now's not the fucking time.
Sure.
The time right now is to take back control of the ship, and that's going to require a generation or two of strong, young, vital men who place the right virtues at the front. And those virtues have to be different than, I need to fucking make another shit coin, make as much money as I can, have sex with as many girls as I can, swipe on Tinder as much as I want to, YOLO. Like, it can't be that. It's got to be
Right.
something more transcendent. And that's kind of, and I'm sweating a little bit now because I'm getting like into this, but that's really the message of the book and who I wrote it for. It's like there's a Venn diagram among us, and I said this at the beginning before we started the call. Like there's like a Christo Hopper Nietzscheanism, right? Like somewhere in that, there's a beautiful alliance, and I think we need to lean into that because I myself find myself there. Like I'm, you know, I get asked a lot, like, "Are you Christian?" I'm like, look, for all practical intents and purposes, yes. Am I as devout? No. But there's just something there that's so powerful and so like in our blood, in that there's something there that's like a connection to the transcendent that
Mm-hmm.
you just can't deny. Like it permeates our civilization. And you know it when you walk into a cathedral, you know it when you meet someone with those sort of shared values. Like it's different. And yeah, I'm kind of going off on tangents now. I'll shut up. But there's something special there, and that's what I wanted to talk to in the book.
Mm-hmm. No, it's something. That's a conversation that I'm familiar with through the way that's being framed on Twitter. Is this idea of like no enemies on the right? The idea that we're all on the side
Mm,
of if we're all on the side of civilizational progress or rebuilding civilization with masculine values, that tends to be a more right-wing coded thing versus a more left-wing coded thing. And so there's a big discussion happening around, well, all of us on the right should not be enemies with each other. Now, I
mhm,
don't personally hold to that because if you run the logic of that out, you get into some pretty extreme beliefs that you can then
mhm,
no longer say are out of bounds. So then the question becomes, how do we determine what beliefs, and again, we're speaking exclusively on the right, what beliefs are out of bounds one direction or the other? Like, are more
mhm,
centrist beliefs out of bounds? Are more extreme fascist beliefs out of bounds? How do we determine? And I like the example that you gave of Saladin, because I think what it speaks to is the idea that you have warriors on the field of battle, and they can look at each other and they can say, we don't worship the same God, right? We don't have this, we're not looking at the same transcendent universe, but I still see that you're acting in a spirit of service,
mhm,
that this is
mhm,
not serving exclusively your own appetites and ends. And that I think is a very important thing. Now there's ways around the margin where it can be tough to determine, is someone serving their flesh, or are they truly serving something higher? But what I like is how you've landed on virtue, because virtue of necessity means sacrificing the flesh,
mhm,
right?
mhm,
My desire says today I want to go eat a pint of ice cream,
mhm,
but I
mhm,
desire the virtue of physical excellence, right? So I'm going to sacrifice my fleshly desires in pursuit of this virtue. And I think all virtues do ultimately coalesce into a transcendent standard. And so
mhm,
being able to say, these are the transcendent virtues that I as a man embody, and I can recognize that in you, and you can recognize it in the other
mhm,
guy. This other guy over there, we're not so sure about. I think
mhm.
that creates a ground that we can all kind of stand on together for this historical moment that we're all facing.
Yeah. Yeah, dude, you just brought chills down my spine, 100%. You
Mm-hmm.
summed it up better than I could have.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's what the book's about.
Cool. Oh, that was a good conversation, guys. Thanks. We did it, everyone. No. Well, I mean, it's really important, because even when I was working in the masculinity conversation, when that was still happening, and I was primarily on Instagram, I would notice all these different interest groups. You had like the barbarian guys, like the Norse pagan kind of vibe, and then you had the elite moneymaker kind of guys with the suit and
Mhm,
tie
mhm.
kind of vibe, and then you had like you had the bodybuilding bros, and so all these people, they had all these different groups of men, these different tribes of men, essentially had very separate value systems. Right. And so, like, how do we get all these guys to work together? And that was the spirit of the Renaissance of Men. Like, look, guys,
Mhm.
and this is I thought when I started my own podcast, I thought masculinity would save the world. I genuinely believed that, and I'll have a lot to say about that on a future episode, but I believe that. So I was trying to figure out, like, okay, like, I'm not trying to rally all you guys to follow me, right? Because I'm not the former special forces guy. I'm not the dude with the giant family. Like, I'm not the 600-pound deadlifter, right? I'm just trying to say, like, hey, here are these transcendent virtues that I think we can all ally upon, and then maybe the guys who are making the thing happen, you guys can lead us forward. So I think you and I landed on very similar ideas, but from different directions. You came in
Yeah.
the door from, like, we're going to make it to this future society that's based on the Bitcoin standard, right? And that's where you came in, and I came in through this other, like, well, we got to defeat feminism and the New Age, and so you and I have arrived at the same place through very different doors.
It's very, very interesting, and that to me points to, if anything, something true. Like
Mm-hmm.
if we didn't know each other before. We've come from different lives, different backgrounds, different everything, and even a different approach to what we felt was the real problem for different reasons. And we've arrived at a similar thing. Like if that's not a signal for some sort of truth, I don't know what is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's something I used throughout the book to try and find signals for truth around, or at least validation around which virtues to select. And it was like, okay, well, if I see this virtue popping up again and again and again in the greatest cultures and the greatest civilizations, then it's not me saying that, hey, courage is important. It's like clearly something about history says that that is important, and
Mm-hmm.
that's why, like, I make clear in the book, it's like, I'm not telling you to do this. Like, I'm going to give you an entire story, narrative, examples, and everything about why this is important. You go make up your own mind. Like, you're an adult, you're a human being, you're hopefully sovereign, and you're an agent. Like, figure it out yourself. But here's a bunch to work with, and then here's a bunch of things to go and read if you want to explore further. But I mean, at the end of the day, I think we know this, a lot of this stuff instinctually. Like, the
Mm-hmm.
words are just more of a reminder than anything else. Like, and that's, when you've been around this space for a while, and I've been thinking, writing, doing, talking, podcasting, all this sort of stuff for a while. It's you you come to realize that a lot of it is almost like removing the fluff,
Mm-hmm.
and it's almost like a remembering as opposed to a discovering. And some of it is obviously always, there's a discovery element, but like the remembering, I think, is quite powerful. And what are remembering? The things that we know, the things that we've been instilled with. And this is why I do fundamentally believe in God, like that we are instilled with something, and we know
Mm-hmm.
this stuff deep down, and we need to be reminded sometimes.
I'm in a bunch of arguments on Twitter right now about the foundations of morality. That people are trying to say that, oh, I can get morality without some sort of transcendent standard, whether it be the Bible or somewhere else. And it's like, okay, cool. You should just that people are saying to me, you should just be a decent person without the need for a book or a God. I'm like, okay, but why? Right? Why are you, on what principles are you saying that I should be a decent person? And people get very frustrated when you push them on that point.
Hmm.
Why should I listen to you? Like, so one guy said to me, like, oh, my morality comes from within and says I should be a decent person. I'm like, cool. So if inside me is the standard, inside me, my morality says I should take your stuff. So who wins in that? And then people get very, very frustrated. But that all of these cultures around the world, and that something about men's hearts and women's as well, point to and orient towards these transcendent goods, and it's just kind of woven into us. I think that undermines the whole notion of evolution. Evolution can't say why this should be the case. Evolution would say that we should live in a survival of the fittest world, and so there should be no such thing as self-sacrifice. Evolution can't understand self-sacrifice. It doesn't make sense. So all of these different virtues point to an author of those virtues. Where did they come from? Why are they there forever? Why, in the middle of historical darkness, a historical level of darkness, why are people still able to look up and see something that transcends all of us, and men feel themselves called to it? Well, because these things are woven into the fabric of reality. Wisdom was there with God when he inscribed a circle on the face of the deep, I believe the passage goes. So these virtues were there before there was anything else, and that's why they call us forward so powerfully. And I think that's also why we're not allowed to talk about virtue. To say that virtue
Mm.
has a
Mm.
transcendent standard, it means that it exists independent of all darkness. In fact, there's a scene in The Lord of the Rings where Frodo and Sam are in Mordor, a virtueless land, if there was one, and they're looking up at the stars and they're seeing something that exists transcendently. And I think
Mhm.
virtues, to speak of constellations, does something similar for us, even when we're in the middle of our own private Mordors or civilizational Mordors.
Yeah, as you're describing that, it reminds me of just like this concept of a north star, and like a guiding light. Like these, there's like multiple ways to frame it, but it all points to the same thing, right?
Hmm.
Um, you said something about transcendence, and maybe this is a good segue into the beauty chapter, right? Is
Mm.
this is, you see this a lot from the theory cell atheists. Like there's that stupid tweet that I saw a little while back from that guy who put up a couple photos of like the like a universe constellation, a beautiful woman's face, and like
Oh,
the
I
coast.
have it.
Tim Urban, I
I
think it was.
I have it here. Wait, it's wait, but why? Let me. I
Yeah,
pulled that up. I'm glad you mentioned. Let me pull it up and I'll put it on the screen, and we can take a look at it. Let's see.
yeah.
Hopefully, I
So
can.
it was Wait But Why, and I think his name's Tim Urban. So he writes like, oh, since all values are subjective or something like that, isn't it funny that we find all this stuff beautiful, and
Hmm.
once we're no longer here, will any of this be beautiful? It's like so stupid to me. Like, and
Hmm.
it inspired an entire chapter in the book. I was like, man, I got to write about this. And like, I did a talk in Prague a couple months ago now, which was called "Beauty Will Save the World," and I bashed a little bit on Tim Urban's thing, and I opened up the quote with something that Nietzsche said. And whatever people think about Nietzsche, some people hate him, some people love him, whatever. Like, I think he definitely had some really profound, particularly his aphorisms. I don't know, like he just had a way of like saying something in a few words, which just like resonated to be so true. And one of my favorite quotes from him is, uh, "If you step on a cockroach, you're a hero. If you crush a
Hmm.
butterfly, you're a villain. Morality has aesthetic standards."
Hmm.
And I love that quote because there's just something viscerally true about it. Like the cerebral part of you, your brain is like, no, like, um, that's not fair, and then the hippie will be like, yeah, but the cockroach has a life too, and like the
Right.
the atheist will say, no, but there's like subjective grounds here, and like even like men of virtue, like if you're religious or whatever, you're like, no, that's not right, it's it's unfair and all this sort of stuff. But something biologically inside you, like you see a cockroach and you just want to crush it. Like, I don't know what it is. um
Hmm.
and if you see somebody like go and crush a butterfly, you're like, what the fuck is wrong with you? Like, why would you do that? Like, it's
Right.
just, and you don't even have to think about it. And that to me just points to something that is, you could call it visceral, you could call it transcendent, you can call it higher, deeper, whatever, right? But like, it points to something more than what the cerebral, cognitive, front lobe, mental construct will sort of tell us. And to me, that's got something to do with beauty, and I think it fundamentally has something to do with God and the structure of the universe, is that there is something there that like we can recognize about beauty. Like I write in the book, like, beauty is not something that you're told. Like, I can't tell you, Will, this is beautiful. Like,
Right.
beauty is something that we recognize, and we recognize it for fuck knows what reason, right? Like, I'm sure we can like find logical reasons about like, oh, the health of a person. You know, there's definitely like practical reasons around beauty, um, but like it exists in the very structure of the universe, and it's not because we can measure it, but it exists and we can measure it. Like, it's the other way
Mm-hmm.
around, right? So like it it is something that, yeah, in my opinion, and I get the sense that you probably share this, is that like it's beauty is this like almost like a beacon to the transcendent that we can all experience, and we can experience it both objectively and subjectively. And that to me tells me that a transcendent realm must and does exist,
Mm-hmm.
because you just can't have that with something that is purely material. Like, and I make a big fuss about this in the book, is like, uh, truth and beauty transcend the material. And this is what a lot of these materialists get wrong. They live purely in the paradigm of the material, and they think everything is subjective and everything you can trade and all this sort of shit. And that's fine for things that are material and purely economic, but it's not fine for living beings that are connected to something else.
Mm-hmm.
And that can't be explained away through economics. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I'll pause there, but I think what you said before about the transcendence just reminded me of the beauty chapter.
I think beauty is one of those things that it calls us forward to those values, even when we can't articulate it. Like, it's not mental, it's not rational.
Mhm,
Beauty
mhm,
is, it transcends rationality. Using our rational minds, we can contribute to making beautiful things. I don't know that the rational mind has ever made something beautiful. I think beauty probably requires more than just strict rationality. I mean, like, I think about the Bitcoin listeners will appreciate this. Like, I think that there's a beauty to Satoshi's white paper, just how clean and how clear it is. But there's an artistry to it that transcends the purity of rational calculation. So there's something more than that. Actually, I tried to share the screen that had the tweet that you referenced earlier, but I wasn't able. Chrome doesn't have permission, so I'll just read it really quick. So this is from Tim Urban, Wait But Why. He says, "It's strange that beauty is entirely subjective. These are beautiful to us," and he provides 4 photos. "These are beautiful to us because of how we're programmed. Objectively, they're no more beautiful than any other arrangement of atoms and photons. The day humans go extinct, everything we find beautiful will cease to be beautiful." And he has a photo of some beautiful photographs of the coastline of Hawaii. It looks like a purple and orange sunset, a lovely flower photographed in high resolution, and then a beautiful woman. And it's just like the idea that I mean, I get beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Like, there's truth to that, absolutely, right? That there is a degree of subjectivity to beauty, but it just kind of implies. I mean, if by the same logic, I guess you could say, like, does anything even exist if humans go away? It's purely existentialist, right? If all humans were gone, how would we know there was anything? Because the counter argument is, say, beauty is a substance, it's a thing. We can't measure it precisely. We can't say where it comes from, but it imbues some objects and people and things and not others, right? Humans have the ability to call it down through skill and mastery and practice and sometimes sheer dumb luck and providence,
mhm,
but it is
mhm.
it is a thing. And if we say that beauty doesn't have an independent existence, how can we say that anything has an independent existence? And what an incredibly nihilistic way to live. And why I appreciate, maybe you didn't intend this when you wrote the book, but I've actually seen some of this nihilism kind of threading its way through the Bitcoin community. Like I don't know, maybe I'll just use his name. Robert Breedlove started toying with some of these ideas, and that's a whole other subject that's going on there that we don't have to get into right now. But like, I confronted him on this. He was reading Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance and some other books about existentialism. I think Martin Heidegger, and so I confronted him on this. And then later I found out what he was doing. Like, yes, of course you're trying to destroy morality. I get it now. But like, this nihilistic, it doesn't produce action in men. Like, you
Mhm,
can't
mhm.
look at these beautiful things and say, well, that beauty isn't real. I don't, it's all subjective. It's like, no, if you give beauty an objective reality that exists independent from us, then it's a virtue that can be pursued. It can become a quixotic quest that destroys you in the pursuit of it. But the healthy arrangement of the pursuit of that virtue, I think, is a good thing, and that men need it. I think one of the big psyops against men is how ugly everything is today. We look,
Fucking
right?
totally. Yeah, yeah. I could not agree more. Like when I read that tweet from Tim, it just like, man, it just triggered me. And the fact that triggered me just says a lot about like the fact that beauty must exist in some way, because it was just like what he said was just so fundamentally devoid of life.
Yeah.
Like, and to me, if we make the argument that life doesn't exist in the universe, then sure, then maybe the need for beauty is not there, or like beauty becomes irrelevant. But in a universe, in a world, in like where life itself exists,
Yep.
um, beauty also exists, and it is not material.
Mm.
It as you said, it definitely, there's a material component to it.
Hmm.
So like there are many material things that are absolutely beautiful, but like it's not only material. And
Hmm.
there's a couple things I'd love to read a small passage from the book,
Please.
if I may. And it says, beauty is simultaneously objective and objective. It's the only thing that we know of with this paradoxical quality other than the divine, which says a lot about what beauty really is.
Hmm.
Beauty is both everlasting and fleeting. It is both powerful and fragile. It is both dangerous and nurturing all at the same time. Beauty can be found in war and peace, conflict and cooperation, violence and love. Few things are as beautiful or violent as a thunderstorm crackling across the sky, a lion hunting, or a volcano erupting. Few things are as beautiful or peaceful as the calm and stillness of the mountains, or a tranquil cove in the Mediterranean Sea. There is beauty in the cold, barren Antarctic ice caps and in the hot, rolling desert sand dunes of Arabia. There is beauty in the smooth contours of a woman's body and in the jagged edges of a sheer rock cliff face. There is beauty in the creation of life and the explosion of an orgasm, in a cavalry charge and in the march of a phalanx. Beauty is found in both deed and object, in both the uncharted, wild ocean of the Atlantic and in its historic crossing. It is both natural and man made. There is beauty in the precision of a Swiss made watch and in the chaos of the jungle. There is beauty in the creative destruction of deep work and in the leisure of stillness. The combustion engine and the jet airline cutting through the sky are both marvels of engineering and beautiful in their own light. Likewise, there is deep beauty in the sword, which has through the centuries shed the blood of many foes. So, like, I tried to do something in the book there to show that like beauty exists in all of these things, and as a result, like it's not a single, like it's not a for something to exist in the fabric of so many diverse, disparate, fundamentally different things, by definition means it transcends all of these things, right? Like, because it's all of them. So if that's not a definition for transcendence, I don't know what is.
Hmm.
Um, and that's why I just think like, another section here, right? Beauty is beyond rational, but we can also rationalize it. It's beyond measurement, but we can in fact also measure it. It's found in the like literally the fractals that make up life: golden ratio, musical octaves, geometry, mathematics. Like we discover it. We don't necessarily like create it. I guess trying to be
We can
precise with
channel
my
it.
words here. Yeah, channel it, I think, is a good way to phrase it. So yeah, it became like I think one of the beautiful chapters of the book. Like and everyone that I shared it with actually really appreciated it. Like it's a great piece. And actually, one of my Christian friends, as he was reading it, he was the one who suggested the Ecclesiastes
Hmm.
excerpt that I put in there as well, to everything there is a season. I was like, fuck, that's so good. Like, so yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah, I think you've captured it, especially because beauty seems to exist. Goodness, truth, and beauty. In some ways, these are synonyms,
Mhm,
right?
mhm, mhm,
Can
mhm,
something be beautiful that isn't true? Can something
mhm.
be beautiful that isn't
Good.
good?
Yeah, yeah,
Right? Can something be good that isn't, right? So all these, in some sense, these are all synonyms. But when it comes to making something beautiful, our ability to make something beautiful, I mean, anyone who's done any amount of creative work, whether it be songwriting or painting or sculpting, you know that you can create 1,000 pieces and like maybe one of them will be beautiful, and it won't
yeah.
be beautiful because of any, again, rational calculation, like I measured it
Mhm,
all out to make it. It's something seems to have informed it
mhm,
spiritually, almost, that passes through us on our way into the thing. And that's the
mhm.
universal experience of creativity. Like, you
Yeah.
just show up writing every day until the muse is there, and the muse is
Mhm.
there some days and not there, and then you wrote something beautiful. Where did it come from? Not me, right? And
Yep.
so, and I not giving people the opportunity to experience that anymore, like just how ugly and how broken and twisted everything is. It really makes us forget that beauty is a thing, right? I think that's the goal. I really do think, like, I think Satan's one of Satan's biggest weapons today is just how mundane everything is.
Yeah.
Houses are
Great.
beige
Yep.
boxes. Have you seen the memes going around that show all the different later model cars that are coming out now, and they all look the
They all
same?
look the same. Exactly. Yeah.
They're all the
Yeah.
same. And then all the logos, like all these classic logos that are all becoming modern, and they're taking off the serifs. And it's like everything is becoming homogenized. Everything is
Mhm,
becoming, and it's becoming bland,
mhm,
right?
mhm,
And I
mhm.
think that's a weapon that's being used against us as men and women, that are making us forget that there is the good, the beautiful, and the true. It's
It
it's it's
kills the
it's profoundly
spark.
dehumanizing. Go ahead.
Absolutely. It kills the spark, like, that's the whole thing, like, and I've got a thing in the book which I say is like, "Look, I think the true definition of evil really is, like, that which wants to destroy the beautiful," and, that's as you said, like, the greatest tool of Satan is to make everything ugly, gray, homogeneous, and lifeless, like, it's and in many ways, like, you look at the ugliest modalities of governance, communism of all things, right? Is the
Mm,
thing that wants to bring everything down to sameness. Like, and
that's right.
an analogy I've used on stage in the past is like, you get a beautiful palette of colors. You have blue, red, orange, green, yellow, and everything. And do you want to know how to make them the same? You get them and you mix them all together and you turn it into one gray chunk of goo, right?
Yep.
So that's like sameness, and that is like, that's fucking ugly. There's a reason why gray is ugly. Like, there's a reason why all the communist Europe is like these gray, ugly buildings, because it sucks the life out of people, and
Hmm.
it just, it sends them on the path to being drones. Like, beautiful things inspire more beautiful things. It inspires life. And if we're on the side of life, if we're on the side of God, if we're on the side of truth, if we're on the side of all these things, we're on the side of beauty. Like, that that requires the creation of more beauty. And as you said, like, I think one of the biggest challenges that we're facing in the modern world is that destruction of the beautiful. It's no
Hmm.
coincidence that the eco terrorists are throwing paint at like orange paint over beautiful Renaissance paintings, right? Like,
Right.
it's not an accident. So, and I think as an extension to that, I should just say, as a call to action to be in line with the whole message of the book here, is that it's up to us to recognize that, and not only just point it out, but to then go and find a way to channel more beauty into the world. Like, I think for the last number of years, and you and I were right in the thick of this, is like pointing out, like, basically acting as a bulwark from, like, I don't know how to pronounce that word properly, but basically acting as like a barrier to all the crap, right? And like pointing out, this is wrong with the world, this is wrong with the world, this is wrong with the world. For me, and the book is my attempt to do this, is to actually produce something beautiful that is no longer about pointing out what's wrong and kind of acting as a barrier to that. It does that in many ways. The book, like, kind of draws that line, but the book's focus, and you really nicely said this earlier, is the book's focus is on what's next, where are we going. Like, I want to lift the gaze. And when you lift the
Hmm.
gaze, you
Hmm.
actually have the opportunity to create something beautiful, because if you're always like looking down and looking at what's wrong, you're just not going to, far less of a chance to make something beautiful and to produce something enduring. So it's kind of my goal for the book.
And I think it's really important, actually, that you included so much Bitcoin mention. Like, it's not a Bitcoin book, but Bitcoin is woven throughout many of the pages. And I think that really matters because if you were to take that out, it becomes, in some sense, ungrounded. Like, okay,
Mhm.
yeah, cool, Alex. Like, we all want to deal with these transcendent higher virtues, but at the same time, like inflation, et cetera, fiat world. By the way, I'll mention this in the introduction to the podcast. I think a lot of what you and I are talking about is kind of informed by the subjects from Thank God for Bitcoin by Jordan
Mhm.
Bush
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
Fiat Ruins Everything by Jimmy Song. Like
Mhm.
the knowledge that's included in both of those books is really important, a really important foundation. So, I'll encourage everyone to go read the books and listen to those interviews, which I'll post in the show notes. But at the same time, without the practical element, without the pragmatic element, then it becomes just a not just, but another philosophical exercise. But once you can
It is
actually
a just,
ground it,
yeah.
please go ahead.
No, no, I was going to say it is just the just. You're 100% right. In fact, the person that I got to help me edit the book, he kind of said the same thing. Is like, do you know what? If you came to me with like another book about Bushido and philosophy and all this sort of stuff, he's
Hmm.
like, I probably would have passed. But he goes, the thing that captured me, he said, was that it was the Bushido of Bitcoin. He was like, what? What the hell does Bitcoin have to do with anything? And he
Hmm.
goes, as I read through the book, because he was new to Bitcoin, he's like,
Hmm.
I sense that. He goes, what I got out of it was that there was actually a exactly what you said, a grounding to something. It's like, okay, all of these things, but then what? Like, or how do we get
Hmm.
there? Or what's the practical element of it? So sorry for cutting you off, but it just
No,
reminded me of that.
that's great. No, that's really good to hear because I think that's what makes the book unique is that it's not just a philosophical exploration, nor is it just an exploration of how Bitcoin can change society. It's an idea of like, okay, once we have this changed society that's rooted in sound money, that's rooted in sound financial practices, what does that enable for men to be? Once we have that grounding, once we have that rooting, and once it can't be dislodged. This is
Mhm,
something that Laser Huddle and I talk about, in our conversations about what does a sound money world look like? What does a sound money do to men? Once you
mhm,
can, learn a valuable skill, earn based on the skill, and then save in Bitcoin. What does that do to your whole outlook on life? And so I see this book as sort of a necessary extension of that thought. Like, okay, you've learned a skill, you've mastered it, you're earning income to support a family, and you're saving in Bitcoin, and it can't be inflated away. Well, that gets you thinking. Actually, this is something I want to ask you about. That gets you thinking about low time preference behavior.
mhm,
And you
mhm.
said that beauty is. I think you said it's the ultimate low time preference behavior. I wonder if you could talk. I was like, that's a really fascinating way to think about that idea. It's
Yeah,
true.
yeah, 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 yeah. So, yeah, in the Bitcoin space, as you said, like there's all this talk about low time preference and like uh, stopping this incessant need to discount the future for the present, and basically the marshmallow theory in practice. And I it hit me as I was writing the beauty chapter. I was like, you know what? Like, beauty is literally the highest manifestation of that approach. It's like to build anything of beauty. You mentioned it before. Like, you've got to do 1,000 fucking sculptures so that one of them is beautiful, right? And like,
Hmm.
you've got to do your thousands of hours of like practicing on the piano or the instrument or whatever, and then at some point you will have the capacity to channel more beauty. Like, there's a sacrifice. Like, the very act of building a family, establishing a relationship, having a child, like, think about the sacrifice and the time preference that is necessary to like to bear a child, for the man to look after the woman, to birth the child, to raise the child, to establish the child, into a teenager. Like, that's an investment in time, and that's beautiful, and that takes time. And like, and that extends all the way up through, like, to build a beautiful cathedral like what we have during the Renaissance, like, took hundreds of years. People who literally started building the foundation knew that they would be dead before they would ever see the cathedral. Like, what does that
Hmm.
take, right, from a person in order to do, like, and that goes on the way up through to like the mountains that we look at, and we have like this reverence for, because it's like this. I know every time I go to the north of Italy, like the Alps, there's just something special about those mountains, and they formed over thousands and thousands of years, like the coastline of Hawaii that we just mentioned before, like the very world that we're in. Beautiful things take time, they take sacrifice, they take an investment, and that's why I just had that epiphany as I was writing this thing. It was like, and it fits so well. I was like, damn, beauty really is like the ultimate in low time preference. And when you try and fake beauty, like it's just, you know it, right? Like it's the you see the difference in the time preference,
Yeah.
and there's always a price to pay for that. So yeah, I think that's a thank you for bringing that up. It's a profound point that I hope I
It's
cover in the book.
Yes, oh, absolutely. It's kind of like those memes that went around Twitter a couple months ago. I think the difference between in women between beautiful, hot, and cute, right? And
I
so
didn't
and
see
so
those.
I
I didn't see those.
oh, it was pretty cool. It was one of the one of the anonymous, maybe a statue account, something like that.
Yeah.
Sort of it used imagery, and it might have actually been a woman. Now that I think about it, to talk about the way that different women's faces create different effects. Like here's a beautiful woman, which is not the same as a hot woman, right? And
Mhm.
so hotness. And there was also someone who wrote about this, I think last year, that talked about the difference between beautiful and hot. And hotness, that's high time preference.
Interesting.
That's where you get all of the plastic surgery and stuff like that to
Mhm,
try and
mhm,
look
mhm,
like this, and it has a particular set of features, versus beautiful, which is a very different thing, right? And
mhm,
so
mhm.
I think this shows up everywhere, and I think our culture is saturated with things that are things we might say are hot. And
Uh-huh,
I don't necessarily mean in the same way like a woman, but like here's this cheap plasticky kind of thing that has this like instantaneous appeal but no
mhm,
substance behind it. It's like
mhm,
those guys
mhm.
that do the videos where they tear apart the Lamborghinis. Have you seen those?
I haven't seen the tearing apart of the Lamborghini. What?
Oh, it's these Eastern European guys, and they bought like this brand new Lamborghini, and then they get into it, and they start pulling on it, and they just start taking apart this Lamborghini, and they show that this
Really?
car on the surface, it's very hot. It's actually quite plastic. It's very cheaply built, and then they slap a massive price. Yeah, so that's kind of like a little bit what our society is you have these sexy on the surface values,
Mhm,
but
mhm.
nothing deeper that's underlying it.
Yeah, a lack of substance. It's like this kind of like manufactured it's exactly, it's like a plastic civilization. Like
Yeah.
plastic is probably a good summation of all of it. Um, yeah, totally, man. Totally.
So was there a virtue that you were studying when you put this book together that had a particular impact on you? Like you're going on this big 2-year journey to write this book, and you're exploring all these different ideas that are changing your world. Was there a section that you were writing, I suppose, other than beauty, where you're like, but that really hit you in a particular way, like
Mm.
where things really shifted for you?
Man, I had so many of those moments, but I'll kind of pull on a couple. So
Hmm.
I'll say courage, because I think courage is like, I almost consider that like the alpha of virtues. Like if without
Yeah.
courage, all else doesn't exist. And I on a podcast that kind of like just came out as I was speaking, I said courage is faith in action, and I was like, damn, that's
That's
good.
pretty
So like,
that's pretty
I
dope.
wrote, I
I
know,
like
that's
that.
what, damn, I like
Yeah,
that.
that's great.
So, but courage has always been something like very, I've had a strong relationship with from a young age. It was like when I used to do Tony Robbins stuff, like I considered it my power virtue. Like it was, so
Mm.
I've always had a good relationship. So not too much of an epiphany there, but other than that little quote that came out, um, for me, a couple of the ones were excellence, like going down that rabbit hole and really just understanding how excellence is fundamentally about hierarchy and separation. It's almost like the ultimate masculine virtue, between excellence and self control and restraint. Like those two were
Mhm.
where a lot of the, I guess, lessons for me, because I'm, at the point in my life now where I'm entering the second half of my 30s, and
Mm.
I'm entering a new season of life, and I'm valuing more like the younger me would have fundamentally valued courage way more. And I still fundamentally value courage as like one of the absolutely most important virtues. You can't be a man without courage. But yeah, I just found something very special about those two virtues in particular, the excellence and the restraint or self-control. I kind of like grouped that together as a concept, and what I called it was the virtue of maturity. Like
Mm,
and a good mental image of that is the ability to um, take a hammer and an egg, swing the hammer, and be able to stop the hammer before you crush the egg.
yeah.
And what I mean by that is like there's so much I could do, and I think this is probably the primary virtue that is missing from the world in many ways. Is like and these two, like excellence as a thing, because everything is now average and all this kind of crap, but also this idea of restraint. It's like, yeah, you know what? I could go and just like cheat on my wife and go and like have gay sex, and I could do all this sort of stuff. I can cut my penis
That
off. Like I
escalated
can,
quickly.
yeah, that's like I was thinking all the dumbest things I could possibly do. I could vote for Kamala. I can do all these things, but should
Excellent.
I? Probably not.
No,
Yes.
please don't. No, don't do it, Alex.
This will be when I reach out in 2 years. I'll be like, "Will, I've got a podcast for you." Chopped off my dick. No, I'm kidding.
I might not have you on. No, we'll
Yeah,
talk you off the ledge.
I would. But seriously, it's like the, y- just because you can do something doesn't mean you should, and I think
Right.
that's underappreciated in the modern world. Like,
Hmm.
and that ties back into what you discussed earlier about like the sexual liberation movement, and I can do whatever I want, and you know,
Hmm.
God doesn't exist, and who cares, and I don't have a father, and I don't listen to my parents, and all this sort of stuff, like trying to shirk um, responsibility and all this sort of stuff. And to me, like it's a little bit different to responsibility. Like I've got a whole section of responsibility, which was one of my favorite chapters, but like self-control and restraint is just, there's something deeply masculine about that. There's something deeply, I'm setting the boundary, and like you said it earlier about I want to eat the tub of ice cream, but I have the capacity to say no, and
Hmm.
that's just like for me deeply powerful. And as I said, I called it the virtue of maturity, and it was one of my favorite ones that I wrote in there.
Your example about the hammer and the egg. There's a famous pastor named Bodhi Bakum who uses a similar example, encouraging Christian men to strength, because he
Hmm.
says that if you give a weak man a sledgehammer and you tell him to swing the sledgehammer and try and bring it down before you stop the egg, he'll crush the egg. But
Interesting.
it's
Okay.
yeah, like that kind of. But if you give it to a strong man, he'll be able to use his strength, and he has the strength to encourage restraint, right? And so like weakness is what leads to this
Hmm.
imbalance of virtues, not strength. But strength has been so shamed out of our culture because, yes, of course, strength has been misused in the past. But to misuse strength doesn't negate the need for strength altogether. It just means we need to bring the moral virtues back that restrain strength.
Man, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because there's literally a section in there about specifically strength. So under self-restraint, there's like 6 sections to the chapter, and there's a section in there about strength specifically, and I lean into like, what is the definition of strength? Like, is someone strong? Like, so am I strong if I enter the boxing ring and I bring a kid in and I beat the shit out of him? Like, does that make me strong? Like,
Like Ben
no.
Shapiro at a university.
Yeah, there you go. So, like, strength is the true strength comes from contending that which is like at your level or greater than you. And that's the only actually, like, funny enough, God made it such that the only way to actually build more strength is to push beyond what is comfortable and push beyond what you can, right?
Hmm.
And for me, that's where like people always talk about, oh, the central bankers, they have all the strength and power and everything like that. And I'm like, no, no, no. Let's flip this conversation on its head. The central bankers and the politicians and the scumbags and all this sort of stuff, these people are so weak that they need to cheat in order to win.
Amen.
They need to poison their opponent, get in the ring, and then say I won. But that is a Pyrrhic victory in terms of like where the like what happens to the game. Like, you didn't win because you were actually better or stronger or more vital or more virtuous or more righteous or anything. You won because you cheated, and that's a fake victory, and that's all we're seeing around us today. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Whereas true strength, as you said, is the capacity to like, I know that I can beat the absolute fucking shit out of you, but I will not, because I have the capacity to, um, like, I'm stronger than the desire. And that was such a, I mean, I use Christ actually as an example in that specific chapter of like the ultimate, the paragon of restraint, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like he's the ideal in that sense. And I also think in that, I'm thinking back now, I think I also talk about like Alexander the Great in that one, where there was a there was the story of how on the way back from India they were trekking through the Arabian desert, and um, Alexander had been shot with an arrow in a previous battle. It was like about a month earlier or something like that. So he was already like weakened from that, like a punctured lung. So it was quite a bit of damage. And as they're going through the desert, like they're strewn out and everyone's thirsty and they've been walking for weeks through the desert and all this sort of stuff. And a couple of the scouts find some water up ahead and they fill a helmet with water and they protect it, like to bring it back to him. And they finally bring it back to him and they pass him the helmet. He takes the helmet and he looks up to the sky and he pours the water out into the sand. And the lesson of that is like, first, that he would share the sacrifice with his men, and sort of like the historic um, story is that when his men saw that, that actually carried them through. Apparently, he only lost 6 men on the trek back through the desert. So that was more important than giving everybody water, but it was also a sign of like an incredible level of restraint, which is necessary for a leader, right? Could you
Mm-hmm.
imagine like a modern politician doing that? Fuck no. Like it's not going to happen. You know what I mean? Like that they would just like they would hide the water from their people and go and drink and like
Mm-hmm.
pretend they're suffering along with them. So it's like that virtue, I think, for me, and I capped off the 10 virtues with that. Like I said, this is, it's not the most important because I don't. It's hard to say which virtue is the most important. As you said, they're a constellation, but it's the one. It's like if courage is the alpha, then self control is the omega. Like it sort of
Right.
caps off the thing. So anyway, I've gone on long enough, but that was the one I think probably had one of the biggest impacts on me as I was writing.
I'm so glad that you picked up on that, because that's something that I've thought along similar lines. Um, that the highest use of power is in self-sacrifice, right? So you look at like whether you can look at the Bible, you can look at Christ, or you can look at William Wallace, right? Or you
Hmm.
can look at Luke Skywalker, right?
Hmm.
You can look at the way that this story is reflected all throughout our culture, right? And in some ways, it's tied to the Christ story, but the highest use of power is not to use it to then get all of your desires fulfilled. Like you attain the highest level of power in that particular story, and what do? You don't use it at all, and you sacrifice yourself, and that has a resonance so far deep within our culture, and I think probably within all cultures around the world. And that's the Christ example, right? In a very real sense, he is the most powerful man to have ever lived.
Hmm. Hmm.
Legions of angels at his disposal. And when you read the Old Testament, you see what angels are capable of, right? You know that he's got legions of them. And what does Christ do? He gives his own life, right? And he doesn't, and that's what the Jews were they were expecting him to use his power. You're the Messiah, conquer the Romans. Like, no, that's not what it's about. You sacrifice, you attain that high level of power. And where I think the discussion gets really lost, particularly in the Christian world, is that gets used to say, don't pursue power at all. And
Hmm.
I don't
Hmm.
think that that's correct. I think you pursue power, but you recognize the point where you lay power down and you sacrifice yourself. It's kind of the ditch on the other side of the road. You have the barbarian ditch, which says, I'm going to use all this power to serve my own interests. And then you have the ditch on the other side of the road, which is the passivity ditch, which is like, well, power is bad because it corrupts or because people misuse it. It's like, no, don't go into either of those ditches.
Yes.
You
Yes.
pursue power and using Christ's example, when to lay that power down for higher purpose and give of yourself, even for a result you're not going to know. Right? Like this is why I like the Braveheart example. William Wallace gives his life. He doesn't know what's going to happen. He doesn't. He just knows that it's the right thing to do in that moment. And then, of course, his people ride to victory afterwards. But he doesn't know that. This is actually my argument against Ayn Rand, is where I started thinking about all this stuff about the pursuit of rational self-interest, because the pursuit of rational self-interest can't understand self-sacrifice, because you're not going to be around to know if your results are successful or not. So this is where the Ayn Rand objectivist philosophy crumbles, because it can't understand that idea.
It does. I grapple with that. There's a whole section in the book on duty and sacrifice, and how, in fact, there's a couple sections. There's also where I talk about the difference between civilian and warrior cultures. Like, warrior cultures highly value the tribe and sacrifice and adversity over where civilian cultures that are more commercial in nature and more merchant-like value individualism and non-sacrifice. So it's like, what do I get out of it? Like, everything is far more a trade. And like, you look at the Spartans, for example. There was a small penalty for coming back without or for dropping your sword or forgetting your sword. There was the death penalty for forgetting your shield. That was because the shield was protecting the man beside you, because that's how the phalanx was set up. So there was a different relationship to this. And yeah, like I believe in the book. I don't know if it was in that section where I kind of like grapple with Ayn Rand's piece, but there is something there that doesn't gel quite well in sort of the commercial civilian world that is far more like, it's different in the warrior realm, which actually, funny enough, I'm thinking out aloud here, ties back to why the warrior class are almost like the bearers of virtue, basically. And like, that kind of, that willingness to sacrifice or die for something is necessary for it to subsist, and that takes a special kind of person that's less interested in just their current material gain, but more drawn to something, once again, transcendent. So yeah, interesting.
I'm thinking about like imagine a tribe, say 100 people, and you have a chief, and then you have everyone else. And if there were some circumstance where the tribe had to sacrifice a man, right? You have to sacrifice one man for, I don't know, rain or to save the tribe or whatever. Like, what kind of tribal chieftain would say, "Bring me the weakest man, and we will sacrifice him"? Right? You would expect that the tribal chieftain, it was a noble tribe, would sacrifice either the chief or one of the closest nobles, but ideally the chief would say, "Take me." Right? If a man has to die to save the entire tribe, take me. And I think that speaks to, I can just speak for myself. That speaks to something so deep within me as a man. Like, yeah, okay, I'll go. Right. And oh gosh. And you can't get there unless you're a strong man, because no one's going to pick the weak guy for a sacrifice. No, like, what kind of sacrifice offering are you offering to God if you're like, well, I'm going to just take this weak and sickly, sheep or whatever.
It's literally not a sacrifice if you did that.
That's right.
Literally, like, the concept of a sacrifice means you paid something, and if it's just like the worthless, the person who's already half dead, it's like, okay, well, then it wasn't a sacrifice in the first place. So it's like, congratulations. So yeah, so you touch on something very, very important there. Like, sacrifice has a price, and you can't you can skirt that as much as you want, but when push comes to shove, there is a real price in blood. There was a great quote that I saw the other day. It's something about all things are priced in blood. I don't know. I got to find that somewhere again. But it was a great quote, which just made me reminded me of what you just said.
It's so rare that men get the chance to explore these ideas, we'll say optionally, right? Like
Hmm.
you got to go on an intellectual, philosophical, theological journey to sort of take all this apart over the course of a couple years and get down to the depths of it, right? And the heights of it for that matter, versus men who like, I want to improve myself as a man, so I'm going to read, Bronze Age pervert, or I'm going to just, pull off a whole bunch of memes. And look, if that gets you started, amen,
Great.
praise God, hallelujah. But the ability to go on this, I guess I might say cosmic in terms of cosmos, this cosmic journey to understand the nature of virtue and the nature of masculine virtue and how that can inform civilization. Very cool that you got to spend time in that world. You get to spend time in Elysium, you might say.
Yeah, man. I mean, I thank you for that, and I will say that I'm blessed in many ways that I was able to do that because I don't know. I feel like I sometimes get asked like, oh, why do you do all the things you do? You're either building a
Mm,
business or you're writing or you're doing all this sort of stuff. And um, my best answer is like because I can, and like, and I don't mean that in like the surface level. Oh yeah, because I can. Like I mean it is like if you're blessed with the ability to go and actually go on these journeys and to push yourself, because writing this book hasn't been fucking easy, man. Like like a lot of time went into this. Like man,
yeah,
the amount of arguments I've had with my wife about like, hey, you don't spend time with me, you're not paying me any attention. I'm like, babe, I'm fucking in the middle of writing something here. Just please give me a second. Or like
captured.
I'm literally stretched between like writing versus I've got people to manage, I've got capital to raise, I've got conferences to speak at, I've got 10 million things. But like, man, this thing is so valuable and important that I want to put it out there. Like, it didn't come without sacrifice, right? It didn't come without cost. But um, to tie it back to because I can, it's like if I've been given the gift or the opportunity to go down this rabbit hole, then I'm gonna do it because I'm alive, and in some way, shape, or form, that's my opportunity to give something back and make my small contribution to the world, to God, to humanity, to whatever. And something about that makes me feel right, good about life and about existence. So, thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, but it doesn't feel like it was and you just said it doesn't feel like it was self-serving, but you also allowed yourself to be changed by the process. Like you're going
Hmm.
to go walking up to these really confronting ideas like, wow, that hit me really hard. What do I do with that? Ooh,
Hmm.
maybe
Hmm.
maybe I got to fix some things, right? But like that's the journey of creativity. It's like that's the sacrifice. Like, well, I really like this. Maybe this didn't happen to you. It's happened to me a number of times. Like I go on this big adventure to explore an idea and I encounter something that's true in there. It's like, wow, that comes into conflict with some ideas that I have.
Hmm.
I really like my ideas, but this is what's true. Well, I guess I'll throw that out. And that's growth, right? But you're dealing with the highest themes of what it means to be alive, what it means to be a man, what it means to serve, what it means to grow, what it means to sacrifice. Like that process, it changes you. And I can
Hmm.
I can feel that in talking to you from the last time we talked about the Uncommunist Manifesto.
Thank you, man. Thank you. It means a lot coming from you. And yeah, I really appreciate you like having me on and just having this discussion. Honestly, it's one of the better discussions that I've had, or one of the best actually. I think that I've had around this because you get it. We're on the same side.
We're on the same side. Praise God. So where would you like to send people to find out about the Bushido of Bitcoin? Now
Well,
that they're all fired up and excited, where can they go?
so depending on when you're releasing this, it'll either be on Amazon. If it's not yet on Amazon, it may still be on pre-sale. So the best place to figure that out would be bushidoofbitcoin.com. If
Okay.
they go there, bushidoofbitcoin.com, the most current links will be there. So if it is on Amazon, you'll be able to click one click buy on Amazon. If it's not yet on Amazon, there'll be 2 links: one to buy it with shitty fiat, and the other to buy it with Bitcoin. And the Bitcoin is obviously cheaper.
Amazing. Well, I'm excited to. So it's been a couple years since we had this conversation, and so now here we are with the Bushido of Bitcoin. I'm kind of excited to see where you're going next. I'm wondering what the next stage in the Svetski adventure will be.
I promise it'll be just as exciting. That I can tell you. What it will be, God knows. Let's see. But I promise it'll be energetic at the least.
I have no doubt. All right, it's great talking to you, Aleks. Thank you so much.
You too, my friend. Thank you.